I'm only going to do this one more time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. I have here, I hope, a special edition. I want to dig into a book that has been way on the memory hole side of things. It's from 1893, and it's called The Synagogue of Satan. And I found it to be a fascinating read. I believe what I'm going to deliver today is an original translation. I could not find one anywhere on the internet. It was difficult to even find this source. I think it's an important work, and I want to discuss it. I will have to discuss major parts of it over on Locals, but I do want to discuss the significance of it here on YouTube. So what I'm going to do is sort of three things here today. I'm going to look at how this work from 1893, it's a work by Leo Meurin, and if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, it's because I've simply never heard it. It's a great work, but I've simply never heard it pronounced. But I want to look at the significance of this in terms of the quote unquote cosmic conspiracy, and connect it to these other memory hold books that I have been examining, and think about the significance of this for the world, for the church. The cosmic conspiracy is the conspiracy against God and man, against Christ and his church. So I feel that it's important to understand who is targeting to destroy Christ and his church, because I think it's helpful information. This cosmic conspiracy has been something that's been understood in the church up until very recently, and I think it has been successfully memory hold. So I think I want to excavate that a bit and go over it and think it through. So number one, I'm going to look at the cosmic conspiracy. Number two, I want to look at a work that came out this week by Owens, dealing with the situation on the ground right now in the world today, current affairs. I just want to touch on a little bit, thinking about how some of the events in the world connect to the cosmic conspiracy. And finally, I want to give you a little bit of an overview of what the book is about. And I found it it's a very good read. And it's unfortunate that it's not available in English. But I'll talk about it a bit today, and I think some of the significant parts of it. So as far as the cosmic conspiracy, I have been talking lately about a number of memory hold people. I broke it down into sort of sections, sort of the earliest 20th century, late 20th century, and sort of in the internet age. And always there was this idea, if humanity could just get this information, we could restore our nation states, restore our church, and properly defend ourselves against this conspiracy. And some of the names that we mentioned, I went through. I'm up to about 8 names. Some of them are coming from a theological perspective, many great industrialists. 5 of them were Jewish people of note, all making reference to the protocols, ... of the learned elders. And that was a common go-to source up until about 1950. And so we have a lot of great names, and I'm just beginning. So a lot of great names. A lot of people were very optimistic that this information would get out and people would be able to identify who was targeting civilization generally, God, man, Christ, and his church. So that was one phase of it, and we're still working through that. Then I went into sort of the mid to late century, especially probably a book that came out in the 1960s was Carol Quigley's really expose of this idea of a goal of certain people on the ground, so we'll call it a Anglo-American elite and a banking elite who had coalesced with each other, and their goal was to dominate the political systems and the social systems of each and every nation. And with that information, there was a lot of externalization of this in the 1970s. There was no longer a talk about the protocols aspect of it, so that got left out. And what sort of disappears from the discourse at this time is something we had in the early 20th century. People like we talked about Father Julio Manville or Father Fahey, who really brought together the church's teachings over the age and applied it to the early 20th century. That is sort of disappeared in the 1970s and the 1980s. It's kind of become more of a cardinal thing that, in order to save our legislative branches, save sort of some of our family values, we have to kind of direct this. It's sort of a frontal attack upon this. And again, there was a lot of optimism that, for example, I read from the book, No One Dare Call It Conspiracy. None dare call it conspiracy. And the authors at the end said, just if you put this book in everybody's hands, certainly everybody's going to quote unquote wake up to this conspiracy and we can fix it. And so it's just a matter of waking up. The internet, again, was an age where the technology now, there's this freedom. It's like the wild, wild west, and never before can we really share this information online and get this out there. Of course, censorship and the algorithms would come into play and change that quite a bit. But what was interesting, I went into a talk or two on the late 90s and early 2000s. Within the traditional movement of the church, there was sort of a recollection of people like Father Fahey and this idea that there's this sort of threading the idea, this is what the church is, this is what the enemies of the church are. We have to clearly identify it. And that got sort of kiboshed over the last 20 years. Perhaps of that whole list, the only person around that's still kind of talking about that would be E. Michael Jones. And I may hit on him again in just a minute. But what I'm going to suggest, something that we argue here on this site, is that we understand the agents of this conspiracy and the agenda. That's why I have a book on this word singularity and the metaverse, because how does that fit into the story? How do we tie up all the events of our day into see a direction of it? How is the church being attacked and to what end? How is humanity and fundamentally the mind being attacked and to what end? And for that purpose, I created the concept of reality. This is a war upon reality, ontological war upon reality. And one of the elements of understanding this perception of reality has to do with the incarnation of Christ. We view Christ, we view reality itself as being ultimate reality, as being Christ. And we have the most proper perception of that through the church. And the church offers us a lens upon this reality that is both transcendent, heavenly, and immanent, earthly. So we have to see sort of both of them at once to see what the church is, what its ecclesiology is, how we relate to the rest of the world, what is theology, how we understand our place here and what we're doing here, why we're on this earth and what we're supposed to be doing. It's eschatology, like what is the purpose? What is the direction of the church itself and where is it heading? So with a proper view of the church and reality in that sense, we should also be able to protect the church, protect reality, protect ultimate reality. And so for that, we have to understand who the enemies of the church are. And the church has always understood this typologically through the book of the Apocalypse, that being one of the titles here, the synagogue. Typologically, it's at odds, it's at enmity with the church. It's an ancient enmity from the beginning of Genesis 3, between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. And this is the story that happens throughout Scripture. And I think what's happened lately is people don't talk about that and don't address that. In other words, they don't take this battle very seriously, because as Scripture said, it's not convenient. So the first chapter of the book of Romans tells us we knew God, we could defend the concept of God, but we fell. And part of the reason we fell is because having God on our mind and defending it was no longer convenient. So we went into sort of what I would describe as a simulacrum, or sort of a counterfeit reality that we increasingly fell into. So I think it's important, the church has always been important to recognize this typologically. Who are the enemies of the church? How do we defend the church? How do we defend reality against this typology, the synagogue? And I think where we're at right now is a place when we think about the reality, we've sort of spiritualized the enemy. It just becomes kind of a feel-good thing. We rely on what feels good in the earth, what the media tells us. And so when we think of the book of Ephesians, we do not wrestle with flesh and blood, but with spirits and principalities in high places. I think people overly spiritualize that. I think there's an assumption that, of course, when we defend the people of God, when we defend the covenant, when we defend the church, we know that there's forces on the ground. That's the story. That's what's being revealed in sacred scripture. There's always an enemy, of course. It's just reminding us that ultimately there's a spiritual dimension in this. So it's crazy to spiritualize it. So anything that goes wrong, it's just the devil, because you're not playing very seriously in terms of defending our culture, defending the faith, defending the church, in my estimation. That's why I'm doing this. The church has always felt it was important to put a name on it so you can truly identify it and not yoke yourself to it. And so that's where we're at right now. Now, this gets a little more nuanced as I'm kind of getting into point number 2 right now. And that is a link that I would like to leave. And it's an article by the Owens Review. It's not long and you don't have to read it. You could probably listen to it in 15 minutes. But it's the kind of information it's not convenient to hear, but it's necessary if we truly want an illumination of consciousness about where we're at in the world today, I believe. So it's going to talk about the situation in the Middle East, things that were revealed or perhaps strategic reasons, but probably most likely for metaphysical reasons. God wanted this revealed. This information has actually been on mainstream television, and it's something nobody's mentioning. So it's kind of hard to go and read about it because it's speaking about conditions in prison in the Middle East. And when you read that, rather just listen to it. It's nice and breezy. There's extended pieces that explain it. It could go up to 40 minutes, but you really only have to invest 15 minutes. While you're listening to this, while there's sort of people are talking about clown masses and events, at the opening ceremonies of Paris, and was there occult numerology going on, and the endless decoding of this, which is very fascinating for those that are curious. But as this is going on and everybody's kind of checking out those channels, this is going on in our world. And I ask you, if you made it this far and you're going to listen to it, you should be asking yourself just a fundamental question. This needs to be at least spoken about to some extent. This is something that is brand new. And Owens will say it's cartoonishly in your face. The level of torture and wrongdoing is cartoonish. And it's not necessarily for some mystical Kabbalistic reason or some externalization, although it might be, but it's just something that needs to be known. So when we're wondering about the attacks on civilization, the attacks on the church, the attacks on our consciousness, this is where we can go with this. We need to have an illumination of conscious ourselves. So Owens, who is revealing this and speaking about it, why are other people not doing it? There's maybe one reference on mainstream television, the monopoly control of most magazines, periodicals are not touching it. It is available. It was mentioned by it came forward because of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, and the International Court on Criminal Justice, or I should say the ICJ. And so it's out there. It's probably the most significant international event going on beyond all the wars and rumors of wars and people armchair strategizing or guessing what's going on in the world. This is significant for human consciousness, for the illumination of human consciousness, dealing in arguably the age of that we're dealing with, in the age of deception. I will argue, and I guess I'm the only one, or I'll point one other person out. You need to ask yourself, why is nobody, and how do I feel about it? Do I feel this is right or wrong? I would hope that you're feeling like, just at some level, at least, okay, I can say this is wrong. This is really messed up, because this is really messed up. And, not only that, but depending on what government you're living in under, you're supporting it. You're tacitly consenting to this by not responding, at the very least. Otherwise, you're saying, I'm okay with what this is going on. This is going on. This is being presented metaphysically to us, I will argue, for a reason. So Owens, who is a secular Jew, is exposing this. Many other people that are Jewish are exposing it to a much greater degree than Christians generally, and much greater degree than Catholics are. Now, granted, we could point our fingers at other Zio Christians that are completely on board, and we can kind of compare that against people that it's inconvenient to look at it. But I just invite you to look at this information, because why we're being attacked today, it's the level of sin in the world. And if our consciousness looks the other way, or it's more convenient to kind of call out a clown mass or some occult ritual apparently going on in another country, without seeing this head on, there's an issue. That's why this is going to be probably a key thing we should consider when we think of a great chastisement, is that we are so hardened that it's not convenient for us to look at these things, even though somehow we know it's wrong. And we're living in an age where a show like Catholic Answers will have yet another one of these. Do Muslims and Christians have the same God? The timing is just crazy. But I would have to say, I'll give you the short answer. Christ said, if they do not know the Son, they do not know the Father. So anybody that doesn't know the Son doesn't know the Father. The question is, some of the people that are willing to look at this consider themselves just humanists, or just some sense of doing the right thing or telling the truth. Why is that? Why are those people ahead of people that are Christians, that are purporting to pick up their cross and take the narrow gate? And I'm not even asking you to speak out about it. I'm just asking you to say, address it. Is this to you right or wrong? Do you see this as a problem in the world today? Much less that we can get into our text for today. And the author would say this is precisely the case. And this is what he is going to argue here in 1893, that this is what, this is directly connected to the chastisement of the world, looking the other way. When civilization, particularly the church, looks the other way to the enemies of the church, they're essentially or tacitly yoking themselves up for the comfort of this world. Will be the author will say that today. So I want to bring that out. So, there are some tricky things going on in the world, and I don't want to go into this too much right now, but for example, this gets into a little bit of complication, but Henry Macau, for example, or Macau, tweeted in response to something E. Michael Jones tweeted this week, which he accused the whole group of the people for I think he said the word like SHIT that's going on. It's like kind of blaming them. So Macau, these are two of the big names of people that are still willing to talk about this on a regular basis, because they believe, for I think slightly different reasons, that this is the issue of our age that nobody's addressing. And so Henry Mako was disturbed, because it's the centerpiece of what he does. He does this in good faith. He's obviously a secular Jew, and he found it offensive. So he tweeted back, and he put on his own page that he was very bothered by this, that when things get perhaps deliberately directed in that direction, because that's a common historical tactic of the synagogue to shift things over there. When this goes down, people are not going to know how to. So he thinks that E. Michael Jones is operating in bad faith. Now, I can't speak for E. Michael Jones, but I think his general position is, when I say all, I don't mean all. So he's going to kind of parcel that out a little bit. But I do think that, as far as what I'm doing here, to be more clear, that we do have to have some subtlety in our thought about this. The enemy wants to crush us and have us become slaves to the synagogue. But we are an offense to them, because if you're true to your Christian faith and the Great Commission, that's to go out and change all nations and consecrate them to Christ. And so that's me in terms of being biblically true and biblically correct with that mission, that I would want people to become a slave to Christ. I think the difference between the two is when you're working for the city of man and you're working for somebody that truly doesn't like you but despises you, and in the other, you're working or enslaving yourself to somebody that deeply loves you and offers you eternal salvation. So, but I understand why these two forces are pitted against each other, and that there is a fundamental enmity there. That said, I think there are a lot of there's some, it doesn't matter how many, there are some that are operating in good faith and that are willing to talk truth to power. And it's important to recognize those people, because if there is a conversion, I think those would be people that very might likely get it. So I think that there are spots where we can kind of think of these. We should hope and pray for a conversion of the synagogue, at least for people that are open to it. And there are people that are obviously, percentage-wise, speaking truth to this issue that Owens is talking about more than anybody else, more than other groups are. And that's a huge problem. That Christians are not speaking out is one thing, but apparently bothered to look into it, even when someone puts it in front of you for 15 minutes for the sake of the illumination of your own consciousness. So I hate how I know it's a downer to talk about stuff and I should be broing it up or something like that, but it's necessary. These are the times that we're living in. Now, one exception to that would be Candace. And this is where, I don't know if I want to enter into all the social media brouhaha, because I think when I talk about this force called the simulacrum, it's a tricky space. And okay, I'll start pointing fingers. I think right now, in my estimation, the Catholic influencer world is going into sort of a dangerous territory. I would imagine if you'd go back 5 years, most people in this world were talking about the catechism, talking about just the history of the faith, and it's become yoked into the affairs of this world, so that if you look at anything that gets views, gets hits, you'll see it on multiple channels. The algorithms like that. The algorithms want this to mesh Catholic theology and the affairs of this world. The simulacrum has, I have argued, a demonic ontology. Even though you think you can present the affairs of the world and put a Catholic spin, it will pull you into it. And when we watch channels like this, we have to be very discerning, I argue, and be very careful that they're not just becoming an attachment of this thing called the spectacle, which is, we can know it probably simply, it's what early Christians absolutely had to escape from, argues St. Augustine, in order to be catechized and baptized. They couldn't have a full Christian existence when they participated in the games. We now have the techno-serpents version of the ancient empire of spectacle. So we live in the modern empire of spectacle. And it's hard for all of us. I'm engaging in social media right now in order to kind of have something to talk about. I do it. I am not immune from it. I would hope that the purpose or value of my channel is being able to identify that and to at least some extent detach from it, because it will pull you in. And one of the key ways it pulls you in is through, and this is hard for some people, but I think some people get it, modern democratic politics that's an attachment to this classical liberalism. We are living at a stage right now where it is the quintessential element of bringing you into this demonic ontology. It is. A lot of people will say it's all theater, and then they'll just think it's a metaphor and get involved in it. It is scripted, especially when I talk about the international and the national level. And it is, as we say, the typical thing, if this is new toward you, it's called the Hegelian dialectic, because Hegel, as who we've argued, Hegel was a Hermetic. So he fully embraced this Kabbalistic system, this ancient Kabbalistic system, which meant that you changed the world by sort of owning both sides, the blue and the red, labor and Tory. And so you pick your poison, thinking one is less poisonous than the other, but we give our consent and it got you. It takes your consent and your soul and will along with it to a large extent. And so it's very dangerous right now. So I wish other people were saying it, but that's one thing I guess I'll say, my comparative disadvantage from anybody else. Nobody else wants to hear this message. I'm telling you, nobody's going to invite you and say, what's your book about? And all this stuff. Nobody wants to hear about this because it's not good for the spectacle. People want the entertainment, right? Are you not entertained? And so before I continue with one person that's speaking about this event that I'm talking about, this illumination of consciousness, I do want to read something that's at the introduction to chapter 9 of In Pursuit of the Metaverse, a book that I really wish had more currency in the traditional Catholic movement, because I really do think it speaks to our age. But links will be in the description for the book. But when I talk about this idea that we can fall into, whether it be E. Michael Jones' idea that there's this group, and it's attached to a type of Gnostic thinking. And again, that can mean a lot of things, but what I mean is that there's this temptation to think that if we could just remove this group, life would be honky-dory. So for the Nazis, it was the Jews. If we could just return them, we could have a 1,000-year Reich and everything would be honky-dory and the Aryans are going to rule the world. Or if we could, for the other side of the dialectic, for the communists, if we could just remove the capitalist, I didn't say the Kabbalists, but it's very similar, the capitalists, then anything would be possible. And so part of both of those views, it just denies our fallen state, that things are going to be kind of messy. We do want to make a better world, and we do want to spread the gospel around the world, but there's a sort of a pitfall into this thinking. And so sort of identifying a group can lead to that kind of thinking. So from the beginning of this chapter is called Once the Enemy is Destroyed. And why I'm highlighting this is that the other part of Gnostic thinking is we start to see the world is broken. It's all their problem because it's convenient to think like that. But we need to identify the enemy typologically, but we also have to understand the people that are not directly a part of that have sold out to them. Many Zio groups that are Christians have sold out to them. Many our leadership has sold out to them, and we all carry sin ourselves. So if we, as some people that accuse people that ask questions, you're obsessing on that, it's always important that this is about fundamentally the illumination of our own consciousness and understanding that we're in a fallen state. So that's just what I wanted to mention when we talk about the synagogue, that fundamentally, to the extent that we can see it in the world, we have to be able to see it also in our own selves. We have to be able to see the sin in our own lives. So it says, Leon Trotsky once said, quote, "Once the enemy has been destroyed, everything will be much more beautiful." The enemy, of course, was capitalism. Once capital exploitation was eliminated, the potential for human self-realization would be unleashed to the point that every street sweeper would be a new Leonardo da Vinci. Karl Marx dreamed of a kingdom of unlimited possibilities in which there would not even be a division of labor, and that the very notion of a profession would be eliminated. Each citizen would be a worker, visual artist, genius of natural sciences, sportsman, politician, all in the same day. And that's this utopian type of dreaming we do in. And utopian adventures aren't feasible. They're not workable in our fallen state, but people fall into this type of thinking. And one of the things is that we can overthink that. And it's important to us to be able to have some sort of subtlety in our thinking. There is a typology involved, but we also got to have some balance in that thinking. So I think that Henry Mako's point was well taken. And he will say, as I have many a times, that some of the great people of truth in the 20th century were names like Myron Fagan, Benjamin Friedman, Elmer Berger, Henry Klein, Alfred Lilienthal, and Henry Mako. And there's others, contemporary thinkers. And that Christ said, I am truth. Those people pursuing truth are on that path, and we do need to recognize that. So I always want to say that I just don't qualify this very much. It's really important. When I was talking last week about one of the great externalizations of the 1920s, the writer reminds us that it is a deeper and older and larger concept than the synagogue, but the power, as we're going to see when we go into the book for today, does reside there. So we have to be a little bit subtle when recognizing that. So I just wanted to bring up that point as well. Okay, where I'm going right now. Okay, I'll get into it. I think some people like talking about this, but the one person that is speaking about this, and it's a fascinating, for whatever reason, I don't know how long I want to go into it, is Candace Owens. So I've never really followed her much over the years because I kind of think of her as one of the Fox, talking head types that's been trained in the she's a great saleswoman. She deals in propagandistic techniques. I'm not going to debate whether or not her conversion into Catholicism was authentic or that some of her truth telling is authentic. And I'd like to kind of say two kind of ways I can go with this, but ultimately I need to be sort of critical about this. I mentioned this in my talk on Friday, and I'm going to do it again. So she is, like, as far as I can tell, the only person that just said, this is wrong. Democide is wrong. And I mean, it's wrong to agree that it's just never been in our face so much. If anybody else was doing this, people would call it out. Why are Christians not calling it out? Why are Catholics not calling it out? Why is our clergy not talking about? And she says this, it's fundamental. And so, I mean, being that I feel completely alone sometimes saying this, I celebrate that. I truly do. I truly do. And she, in fact, and here's my issue. The people that don't talk about it either feel, oh, it's just the devil. And the church has never thought about it in those terms. And my issue is when you do kind of put yourself out there, you have to speak, on separate channels to talk about it. You take a hit in every way possible. Not that I'm boohooing, but that's what it's like. And nobody cuts you any slack for that. It's like you're shadow banned. That's your deal. I'm kicking it over here. I do have kind of an issue, and Candace mentioned this. It's like, don't tell me you don't talk about it because you're too sophisticated or too virtuous. You're not talking about it because of blank. And she filled in that word. And I'm not going to say it, but it's not a good word. So don't disguise that blank because you're not going to speak about it with something virtuous or your sophistication because it's bigger than that or older than that. No. The tradition of the church has told us who this is. The tradition of the church has recognized a cosmic conspiracy, and I'm going to speak about it once again today. And to the extent we're going to have doom channels that talk about everything going wrong in the world, yet don't address that, are just really adding to the simulacrum, the hyper reality, the simulation of it all, because that's what it feeds off of: fear and doom and helplessness. And once we do identify it, we are at least spiritually empowered to understand that to the extent we bring it back into ourselves. I'll argue. Okay. So Yeah, so we did have some traditional Catholics that would address it in the late 90s, early 2000s. They did get hit. They were called, oh, the terrible thing, anti-perfidious. And every one of them, I went over it, was talking about the same cosmic conspiracy that the church has always spoken about, which should just be common currency. So it's kind of crazy. So the writer that I have today, or the thinker that I have today, is going to go into it, and just because of the time and place that he's writing, he sees it from a lot of interesting angles and kind of helps illuminate us to the enemies of the church. And I wanted to mention that. So in summary, I'm going to go over the author of the book. Before I do, I simply cannot talk about the book, even if I wanted to. So I'm going over to locals, everybody. It's free to be a member. There are some free things you can do over there, but the bulk of the things that I'm writing, and I'm deliberately writing material that I otherwise just am too busy to do. I'm putting it out there. I'm going the redlining my life here and my energy capacity to put original content, some of which just can't be mentioned anyplace else. So I do want some value added over there. It's simply stuff that you couldn't otherwise have. So I'm putting some of that over there. If you want to be a supporter, that's where the bulk of this is directed to. It is $5 a month, and it's just reviving me. I really do feel that there's a community over there, getting to know people, and it's just growing, and it's great, and it's just a treasure. So that is something, and I'll put the actual text of the book over there. So yes, the book is going to argue that there's a cosmic conspiracy. And one of the points is I'm going to look at the Wikipedia article that this guy is a great thinker. He was probably, you have to resurrect this knowledge. I don't know how much currency this has in the French-speaking world, but it's just this information. It's hard to even find the person's name, much less anything written in English. There is nothing written in English. I did the translation, or at least had the help of Google. One of the themes here is that we can't just say the stonecutters. That just won't work. We do have to identify them, who they are, and the animating typology behind it for it to have any force in the world. So he's repeating that idea. Even if we suffer, even if we seems like nothing happens, because who knows, and 125 years old later, somebody might pick it up and put it into a Google Translate and revive it again. So our efforts at a spiritual level are not for naught. We need to fight for truth. Christ is truth. You need to fight for truth. So what he's going to argue, he's really a master of world religions, and I'll show you that in a moment. He's going to say that all religions collapse ultimately into one eschatology. And what I mean by direction, that we're working, all themes of conquering world domination comes down to two purposes, which I have defined. I'm kind of upgrading his language into the singularity. All paganism crunches down into this project with the goal of singularity, the goal of the metaverse, which are instruments of world domination. So I found that part very interesting. And ultimately, he's also giving us an indication how we individually should respond and how the church should respond. And it would be great if people in the church were dealing with this and can tell us that. But I guess we have to go back 150 years plus. So I'm going to finish off by just touching on Leo Meurin. I'm sure I'm butchering that. And I am going to pull this up for us just so you get an idea of who I'll be talking about over on locals and how this could add to these memory hold individuals that I have been bringing up. Nesta Webster was the name I was trying to get. She reminds us when she's looking, she is connecting the cosmic conspiracy, and that is the protocols, with the Illuminati, with the Communist Manifesto, with other Eastern manifestos, and there is one conspiracy she's going to argue, but she does remind us that there's a danger in including all people in this. And it's a very, you have to, when you're truly going to be enlightened about that, it is important to think the spiritual element and to kind of think about this with charity. And so I just want to be that guy that mentions that. So what I have here, I wasn't able to get this page translated, but I can read it for you from another page. So Leo Meurin was born in the Kingdom of Prussia in 1895, and ultimately he became the Archbishop of Bombay. So one thing you can kind of guess is he's going to have a good understanding of Eastern religions. And some of these sort of world systems at the East have been famously some of the most difficult to penetrate with the sort of what we oftentimes call the concept of logos. That being said, let me go down here a little bit. So he was a Jesuit, and obviously I'll just get to the gist of it. He was extremely well educated. He was, ultimately, like I said, he was the Bishop of Bombay. He was out, and I would argue that he's probably one of the leading experts in world religions at the time. So this is no schmuck. This guy knows what he's talking about. And part of, course, the Jesuit mission was to go throughout the world and deliver the gospel and extend Christian civilization. There is one point I just want to mention down here that's kind of wild. This is a book down here, bibliographies about them. Says almost nothing. Oh, Christ in Bombay. I didn't see that one, 1882. That has been translated. Norman Cohn. So what Norman Cohn is talking about right here is it's completely written in another language. So Norman Cohn is going to criticize the bishop. And he's going to criticize this idea that there is a cosmic conspiracy. So I thought about how am I going to address this? So literally the title of my book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, is a play on his famous 1957 book, In Pursuit of the Millennium. And so for Cohen, he was an English historian, and he was very good at going into archives and scraping together some unique material, and that book has been republished several times. So he, to my mind, identified a type of conspiracy that I kind of pulled into the Christian narrative and this idea of a cosmic conspiracy. But his idea is there's always been this mind virus, and it started with the Jewish people, and that it reappears in the Middle Ages and usually produces social derailment and so forth. It's kind of crazy. The world is going to end, the millennial age. And it, eventually we kind of wonder about Zio-Christians and the idea of the rapture and stuff like this. This is the deepest source of that mind virus. So he identifies it in the ancient people. Deep, we're talking about like 1000 BC. It's deep in there. And this idea these people have been so overwhelmed and so trodden upon that in his mind, they create these utopian dream worlds to escape. So one thing that Cohen does is he goes through a lot of people that I have memory hold, the most famous ones, and said, no, false. He goes through the protocols, false, forgery. And he had enough weight that helped memory hold these ideas. So here's part of the problem with Norman Coleman is that he thinks the Bible is fiction. He thinks the Old Testament is fiction. He thinks Noah's Ark is fiction. He thinks the Tower of Babel is fiction. So he thinks if it's all fiction, there can't be any conspiracy. So he very disdainingly, he was a Marxist, kind of just writes this off as a fantasy. So he wants his sort of version of he won't call it a conspiracy. He'll call it like this trans-historical, what I called mind virus, and that it eventually affected Christianity and much of the modern age. So I call it the pursuit of the metaverse, because part of this mind virus is these utopian visions that are eventually going to work through the mimetic or dynamic ontology of the spectacle, which we're being in, or I call it the egregore. And an egregore is a mind virus because you like to talk truth, except a little bit that's inconvenient. And as Eric Voegelin would say, that creates a second reality. He would also essentially use these same kind of ideas as Cohen and trace these second realities, these utopian quests throughout time. And the ultimate utopian quest seems to be this effort. And you'll even see it. Owens will talk about it. Now he'll lay it all out. If you want illumination of consciousness, spend 15 minutes. I'll leave the link in the description of Owens. But ultimately, it's this Jewish utopian vision that requires this sort of assistance of the techno serpent. And so when we talk about the beehive consciousness, the internet of bodies, the internet of all things, eschatologically, that's what this is about. This is the conclusion of this project that is pitted against the seed of the woman. And what it really is in modern terms, and Leo Meurin recognizes the significance of the Zohar. All of this is a movement toward Antichrist, which means it's not truly an ancient religion. It's put a mask on. The synagogue are people that say they're one thing or the other. It's in fact, what it's really doing is it's working and it's pitting itself against the seed of the woman, and in its fullness, that is Christ in his incarnation, Logos, the God, the creator of all categories and things, coming into humanity and taking a human form. And so his incarnation, death, resurrection, and ascension, the whole thing, but this project works in a sense to reverse engineer Christ's incarnation. That is the fullness of Antichrist. And it necessitates technology to reach its fulfillment or its final fruition. And so it's a singularity, which all minds have to be brought to it. And I believe that's what's going on in the book of the Apocalypse, when we trade the image of God for the image of man. And we're doing that every day. We sell out our illumination when we don't address issues like this because they're not convenient. And ultimately, it's a metaverse, or sometimes people call it techno beehive. And that's part of literally a vision that was drawn out in 1934 in Michael Higger's The Jewish Utopia. So when we start to kind of see the direction of this, there's two things I would make. It just helps us understand to identify so that we can detach and don't get attached. This is the age of deception. The devil's working very tricky stuff. The devil's all about working religion and working scripture, against us. So we really do have to be wise as serpents. And I would just say that when we see this trajectory and how it's working and can make sense of what Musk is up to and what our political leaders are up to, we help identify it. And I realize I didn't finish off here talking about Candace Owens. I finished it. So she is speaking this crazy truth. And I hope she's sincere. I hope she's a truly converted Catholic, because I completely understand when you see fully what's going on. The biggest danger we could have today is to believe nothing. There's one fundamental truth, and it is the rock, that which is Christ and his church. And we need to recognize that, and that the conspiracy is ultimately against the church, even if the church has been infiltrated, because Christ told us there'd be wheat and tares in his church. So it gets kind of tricky when we try to kind of think about church and anti-church and stuff like that. Okay, so all of that's great. She's virtually the only one talking about this. And she's saying. The people are not talking about this. If you're a Christian, you're a blank, begins with a C. She said it. And here's the problem. So she kind of, and I mentioned this Friday, and I'll just do it again. So she mentions kind of when she does her show after all her commercial spots and so forth, that someone asked me a question. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. But she said, like, who should we listen to? Are you the only one telling us these truths? Digging up research that's pretty old. And not all is there. So where am I going with this? What she's saying is great. So she says, Dave Smith, Tucker, and then she proceeds to go and have a conversation with Alex Jones. So this is part of what many people have seen as a very controlled network narrative. And so they're telling you like never before, externalizing the hierarchy, really getting you drawn back in. Remember, the ultimate piece of this dialectic is the fake democratic process. And it pulls you back in. Every time we kind of get tired of politics and see it's the same bird with two wings, it pulls us back in. Typically, what we call in politics is it's the median theorem. And so there's people at the base that are exposing more. If I'm in, am I going to expose, put these JFK records out there, and they kind of feed their base. But by the time it gets to the middle of the election cycle, they're talking very similarly, and it becomes really just cultural appeals and appeals to wokeness, i.e. woke versus anti-woke. And, it is just no coincidence that whoever this vice president, whatever this woman's name is, that she's just out there saying, like, if I'm going to keep woke in, I'm woke. She's doing that to push buttons. And it's easy to, just to go, I want to shut that wokeness up. It's very tempting, but it's part of the script. I'll argue. I know it's hard for some people, but I'm increasingly, compared to a couple of years ago, nobody wanted to hear this on this channel. And there are people, and people in local seem to be getting that. And the question of what do you want us to do? Waking up and pulling apart and detaching is a full-time job. It really is. You can get involved in sharing the community, get back into an authentic Christianity. It's a full-time job. So here's my concern with Candace. So it's hard for me to check some of this stuff out. I am very sort of selective of when I'm going to kind of put time into this. I have noticed somebody sent me a video this morning about, trying to think of the guy's name. There's a couple Catholics that are kind of playing with this a little bit more. And if you're kind of only going part way with the conspiracy, it's famously, as I've said for years, made a number of videos, part of the chaos magic is absurdity, fear, and conspiracy. It's part of it. It's unveiling of this is part of the simulacrum. It's part of the demonic ontology. It's part of the mimetic pull. So you want always to be externalizing, just like candidates do when they want to appeal to that base again. I'm going to be different. I'm throwing some new stuff out there. Our curiosity gets leaked and we're pulled back in to the show. So she's talking to Dave Smith, and she's saying kind of the same stuff, like that genocide is wrong, if I can even say that word. Why are people agreeing to it? Why are we spending money on it? She's not making reference to this article, not that you have to, but this one just really hits it right on the head, this unswing that's going to be in the link. But as you're listening to it closely, it's always, as the regular truthers, anybody that's been around the truth channels for a few years, always pulling you back into the left-right dialectic. So if you're opening somebody up and still kind of saying that the process is legit, and of course you have to vote, and we've heard this, and she's always talking about now calling herself every 5 minutes a conspiracy theorist, and they're using words like the normies aren't going to get this. They're part of the public school education. That's slightly Gnostic in a sense, because it's like now we have this special vantage point. So when you're kind of pulling people into that and not saying that clearly there's problems on both sides. Many years ago, I recognized that about Fox News. It's just a cheerleading thing. Everything's always wrong with them. Nothing's wrong with our candidate. Everything's wrong with this typology. I have no sin. It's very problematic. A truth seeker should always be looking ultimately for inner illumination of consciousness. And that's sort of what I'm arguing here. So the final point that she brings up, they turn it in. So when she's ever talking about, not just talking about Alex Jones, who's like just full on getting you back into a very fake narrative of what's going on that I completely reject. I know it's hard to do because the alternative media has become the simulacrum to the extent that the Catholic influencers cannot identify themselves as completely separate from that. If it's just their stories, plus they think a little bit of a Catholic spin, I will argue that's a dangerous place to be. You have to be very vigilant about entering that space with your consciousness. So finally, not only that, it's just Trump, 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 Trump. She's even going to say J.D. Vance is great. So you just show Kamala cackling. I know this is a little American for my Australian and Irish friends and Scottish friends, but you get the idea, because this is the empire of spectacle. So when the infection hits one place, it spreads every place else. So, you play the Kamala clip with the cackles, with the unshackled by whatever, and you play that. And I mean, anything's going to sound good. So, but when she's to the point of, and we did this on this show a little while ago, I'd encourage people to look at somebody like Whitney Webb. It's important. She's not a Catholic. I doubt she's a Christian, but she's saying some essential things that we need to understand to maintain our faith, I would argue. Another one, Anya Parmpil. I'm saying that quite right, not quite right. They're talking about not just Vance, but these connections from the right, all of the stuff that's bringing in the surveillance state like no other, and all the good now reasons from the right to hook into a new surveillance state, and ultimately the internet of bodies. It's the singularity of all things coming from the right. It's just not enough. If I have to be the only guy saying it, it's just not enough to choose from the lessers of two evils. The system is fixed. Whoever they've decided has decided. If you think you're strong enough to kind of play with this, it's kind of like if you're a guy out there strong enough to look at a little porn but not get pulled in, I'd very much connect these two ideas together. I'll give you a little bit of leeway with the social media because we all do some, but it really takes control of us. It really takes control of us. It really does. And so one of the features is when news stories get recycled and recycled, there's manufactured outrage that's built into it. So the most perfect example is when the media wants you to have outrage. They allow you to have outrage by what's going on in Paris. When you take that and watch it more than 3, 4, 5 times, the same outrage cycle, you are getting infected. And so that's part of this biopolitical control system. And it's unique because it's not like control systems from the past. It doesn't rule us through chains. It rules us because it controls us from the inside. It's absolutely unique in that way. We think it perverts our free will. And so it controls us, and we don't realize that we've been infected. So the reason I am and have always talked about things like biopolitics and this idea of a spectacle is because society tells us, of course, everybody watches Netflix. Of course, everybody watches some social media. You have to be sort of informed. And it's a kind of a rare bird that's going to come out and say, and there are some priests that do it, God bless now, that, the television is it's Satan's sanctuary. As one famous priest from the 1950s said, it's like having the synagogue in your living room. So if you think you can handle that, and ask yourself, all these years you've watched this talk box, how many times have you just heard somebody just outside, maybe here or there, crazy televangelist who's completely working for the synagogue? How many times have you just heard the gospel on the TV? Think about that. Think about how much information you're getting. And Netflix. And I know the level of quality of entertainment has gone up with the HBO and the Netflix, but it's very seductive. And I don't want to be preachy and all of that. That's not where I'm kind of coming from, because I think the new wave that we all have to be aware of, and me included, is just the insidious nature of social media. And the people that designed it in Silicon Valley and so forth, they've let us know how these sort of, um, these hits that we get, these adrenal hits, these dopamine hits work. And, I'm on social media. I know it's dangerous. It really is. So where am I going with all this? I want to recap. So I've mentioned 3 points about a cosmic conspiracy that I'm going to continue with. I'm going to take a vantage point of this from a text that's not available in English that I've translated. And it's very good stuff. It really helps us think through this typology, and it helps us to kind of think about what do we do once we have identified this, like as Christians, as Catholics, what do we do with this information? So I've talked about that a little bit. I've done a recap of when he's talking about this in the late 19th century. He's a Jesuit. I will, in a couple of weeks, bring up some other Jesuit documents that completely, in enormous detail, describe the nature of this cosmic conspiracy. So we have 2 Jesuits from the late 19th century that are really putting it out there. And then we have these people, many of them also representing the teachings of the church in the early 20th century. How the Jesuits kind of went off the rails, I do not know how that story works. But at some point, people like Teilhard de Chardin started to kind of get into this in pursuit of the metaverse kind of thinking. Like I read from the end of Marx there. Someday there'll be no professions and no structure whatsoever. It'll just be this omegic cosmic blob of love. So, I don't know exactly how that story works out, but at the late 19th century, the Jesuits were spreading the gospel throughout the world and truly trying to defend the faith. So that's a story in itself, but I do want to deliver some other pieces of that, and some of it hopefully even here on YouTube in the next coming weeks, because those documents from the Jesuits in the late 19th century really just lay it bare like nothing I've ever seen. So we went over some of that cosmic conspiracy in the hope that just if people understand it, we can save our civilization, save the church. It appeared again in the 1960s, but in a more cardinal form, minus the sort of transcendent frame of the church. And it was more from a political perspective, just like we have to approach this on the ground and talk to your legislatures, the few good ones that are left. And that kind of died down again, and memory hold. People had no recollection of it. The monopoly on publishing and information was effective. And the threats. There was, again, in the traditional movement in the late 90s, early 2000s, an effort to revive these thinkings of Father Fahey and so forth. But that has pretty much been successfully crushed. And here we are today. And I am going to argue that because it's been crushed in the past, that doesn't mean we should have the attitude that since it's memory hold, I'm not responsible for thinking about it. If you're truly interested in sharing the gospel, understanding the nature of the enmity between the church and the seed of the serpent, it's important to understand. And ultimately, this needs to be done in a spirit of charity and, not to sound corny, but of love, because ultimately, our goal as Christians should be the consecration of the whole world to Christ. And so we have to be open. People are in different spots from where we're at right now. We don't want to yoke ourselves to forces that don't identify Christ as being the savior of humanity, but we do want to be open to bringing them the message of the gospel. So this has been Dr. Deep State for today. I'm going to go over to the Locals channel, and we're going to get into this text from 1893. And I'm not going to say it again because I've said it enough times. So I hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to be back with you very shortly. This has been Dr. Deep State.